Is the most logical explanation that a dead guy came back to life, or the most logical explanation that someone took his body, because that's what the Romans said? People see things.
Yeah, of course, I'm never going to be able to convince you if you just think it's impossible.
There's a lot of people that are not that bright.
Yeah.
They're not smart, and they're easily led, and they're easily manipulated.
What is the best explanation of this fact?
The likelihood of someone coming back to life is very low.
Right.
The likelihood of someone taking his body is very high. Is the most logical explanation that a dead guy came back to life, or the most logical explanation that someone took his body, because that's what the Romans said?
Just because I'm saying that
You
is
think
that
he came back to life?
one time, and I'm not saying I'm crazy about it. I'm just saying, you know what? After reading that book, there was enough things that happened that historical scholars who aren't religious, some are believers, some are not,
Right. but
are
you're-
like, this
but-
existed and this happened.
But you're talking about historical scholars from 2,000 years ago.
Right.
And their knowledge of science and biology and
Right.
life and the universe itself was extremely limited.
Right.
And so their entire fundamentals, like everything they believed in, was based on mythology. Everything was based on gods and demons and
I would like to hear your answer. Someone says that to you, like Joe Rogan just did to him. What would you say?
Yeah, so if I just heard the claims, the two claims that, hey, this person rose from the dead versus somebody stole the body, obviously if that's all I've got in front of me without the context, without any other evidence, anything to think about, then yeah, the most reasonable explanation might be that somebody stole the body. But there's a big context that sits around this thing. And when we're trying to figure out what happened with the resurrection of Jesus, the alleged resurrection of Jesus, we're doing what in philosophy is called abductive reasoning. Now don't get bogged down with that. All we're really saying here is it's an inference to the best explanation. Given what we know, what is the best explanation of this fact? And there are a lot of things that play into why we kind of build a case, like a lawyer might build a case to explain why we think that Jesus rising from the dead is the best explanation for this. So just to throw a couple of those out there, Brett, I would say, first of all, we already believe there's a God. If one doesn't believe there's a God or believes supernatural things are possible, well, they're automatically going to put a really low probability on the claim that
Right.
Jesus was raised by God from the dead. But if you do believe there's a God, then you already have a power sufficient to do something like raise somebody from the dead. And when you consider that Jesus in his earthly ministry talked about himself as though he was this special agent to bring about the kingdom of God, and talked about his what was going to come at the end of his life, it was as though he was walking around with a sign saying, just watch my life and see what happens. And you pair that with the fact that even liberal Jewish scholar Paula Fredrickson, who's not a Christian, no friend to Christianity in that sense, she says about the earliest believers after the resurrection, the alleged resurrection, who changed their lives and went on to start new mission works and spread around the Mediterranean world. She says, as a historian, I don't know what they saw, but I know they saw something. So there's a lot of different pieces to this puzzle. I would agree with someone, it doesn't seem very logical if you've just got the two claims, but when you put in all of the evidence, I think we get a much more compelling reason to believe. And then the claims that he's talking about, that the Romans or the Jews or whoever said that they someone had stolen the body, that actually increases our reason to believe, hey, there really was a tomb that was found empty. So all of these things kind of work together. And I think when you take that whole picture, you find out that actually logically, the best explanation, if we're trying to pick among explanations, this one actually accounts for the most of those details, a lot more than just saying someone stole the body did.
Okay, so then what about this? All right,
Okay.
fine. What if the Romans, okay, they made it up, right? I'm sorry, the Romans are correct. The disciples took the body, who everyone agreed was dead. What about the 500 people that saw him in the town over the next 6 weeks?
Now, before they get too deep into that, I do want to go back to, because I think a lot of people would go with Joe Rogan and say it's pretty logical for modern people to say, okay, well, you're talking about people who lived 2,000 years ago. They thought everything was supernatural. So how do you kind of bolster the case that way? How do we trust the people that were being talked to by?
Yeah, well, first of all, he mentions science specifically, and I don't really know how science comes into this discussion about these historical matters, except if you're holding the position as Joe may hold that, well, scientifically we just know people don't come back from the dead, so there's just no chance that Jesus came back from the dead. But that's kind of like something he comes into the conversation with, if he does, believing in naturalism or something like that. Well, then of course I'm never going to be able to convince you if you just think it's impossible. But whenever we're talking here about so science, the only way that I can see science coming into this would be if he was to if Joe actually were to raise the concern that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, but was later resuscitated in the tomb by these first century fishermen. You know, that's a criticism that some people say, well, maybe the reason Jesus was able to appear to others after his death is he didn't really die. And then actually we can employ science to say, from what we know about Roman crucifixion, actually scientifically, that's really unlikely that they would be able to. So science, I don't think, comes into it. The fact that we're a long time removed from it, there was one Goodhold Lessing who brought that as a concern. He said it's as though we've got this ugly, broad ditch between, you have to really enunciate there, between two cliffs, and that represents time. And I can't get across that cliff to get back to those events of the first century. The thing is, we actually have incredible historical reason to believe certain facts about about these events surrounding the resurrection. These are called bedrock facts. Mike Lycona's got a great book, The Resurrection of Jesus, and in it he lays out what are considered these bedrock facts. A bedrock fact is one that the consensus of historians, whether they're Christians or not, there might be atheists, there are going to be atheist people doing New Testament study and history on this, and the bedrock fact is agreed upon by the consensus of scholars, and it has to be highly evidenced. So there's a few bedrock facts here. One of those is that Jesus did live, that he died by Roman crucifixion under the prefect Pontius Pilate, that people after his death had experiences that at least they interpreted to be appearances of the risen Jesus. They really believed that. And then they were willing to spread that message around the world. So I think these bedrock facts are considered that way by the people who are experts in this and study this all the time, the historians. And we can know these things, they think, past doubting about those moments that have to do with what we would think is the resurrection of Jesus. So we just take those few. We don't take the broad sweep of things that we as Christians might want to include in that. We just take the ones that the best historians say, yeah, you can use those. And I think we can get back if we stick to some of those.
So modern historians don't have a hang-ups with the worldview of mythology or any of that kind of stuff that ancient people had. They're going off their own knowledge and the evidence that we can.
I'm glad you raised that again, because you make a good point. Yeah, let's just imagine that all of them were very, very religious people, and maybe they were. Okay, but what happened with Christianity, that makes it all the more strange what these earliest believers did, because these earliest Christians changed the way they had been worshiping and functioning religiously. Now, I was raised Southern Baptist. Now, let's imagine that suddenly I experienced something that was so dramatic that it made me start functioning like a Muslim or something, worshiping on the days and the ways that they worship and all of those kind of things. That would be shocking, especially if it was like an overnight thing. You would think Braxton must have experienced something really strange. Well, all the more if we've got religious people who are functioning on a certain day of the week is the day we worship God, and this is what we say about him, and this is what we believe about the resurrection of the dead at the end of time, and all those kind of things. And then in a moment, you change and start worshiping another way. I actually think that bolsters the case for the resurrection.
Oh, okay. Well, I hadn't thought of that. That's good stuff. Maybe Chris thought of that.
Talk to those people?
No.
So who knows
I don't
what
speak
they
Hebrew.
believed, but who knows what they actually believed? Who knows how they said it? Who knows if it was a religious thing? You look, there's people that have mass hallucinations all the time about a lot of things, and there's people that you could give them false memory. False memory is a real thing. Someone can convince you that something happened that didn't happen.
Right.
It's real. It's like they've demonstrated how to do it. We all know friends that have a memory of something, and you go, that's not what happened. And then you say your version of it, and then everybody has to like figure out what really happened.
Right.
You know, you're like, do you remember that time we were at the game and you said this? I didn't say that. Like, that was not me.
Yeah.
That was Mike.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're like, what? Yeah, you remember Mike lost his job? And
Right.
he was drunk. Do you remember? And they're like, oh, yeah. Like, you thought it was me. Like, you put it on me. It's like,
Yeah.
you change things. Like,
Right.
people change things.
Right.
They also, your memory becomes a memory of your memory and not the actual memory itself.
True.
It becomes a memory of the story you're telling.
Right.
And so if this person was this significant religious guru figure like Jesus was, right? And he really does have this amazing view of how humanity can live in harmony. And he really does talk to people about this. And he really does preach forgiveness. And he really does like to treat everybody like they're the same, paupers and hookers and
Right.
everyone. Everyone's just God's children, loved. When that guy's gone, you're going to miss him, man. You're going to miss him bad. And
Yeah.
if you really do have a fundamental view of reality that's based entirely on myth, and you have connected this guy to the Son of Christ, or the Son of God, rather, this figure that is brought here to save us, and the Romans took him from us and killed him, and now he died for our sins, and the whole thing.
Right.
If you have that in your head, and then someone says, "I saw him," like I saw him too.
Right.
Like people see the Virgin Mary in a grilled cheese sandwich. People see things.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean those things aren't there.
Right.
It doesn't mean that isn't a vision, but it also does mean that people see things that
Yeah.
aren't. And there's a lot of people that are not that bright.
Yeah.
They're not smart, and they're easily led, and they're easily manipulated. But it also doesn't mean that Jesus wasn't real.
Right.
Like all those things. But it's just the likelihood of someone coming back to life is very low.
Right.
The likelihood of someone taking his body is very high.
Right.
So if you used like Occam's razor, the simplest solution,
Right.
the simplest answer is probably what you're searching for. It's probably that someone took the body.
Well, that was a halfway good speech by Joe there. I mean, the thing with the grilled cheese sandwich and all that stuff. So what about that? I mean, the power of suggestion, I want this person to be there, mass hallucinations and
Yeah,
thoughts on
so
that?
I heard him mention three things there: mass hallucination, false memories, and he didn't call it this, but grief hallucinations. When you miss someone, they've died or something, and you want to see them again. Grief hallucinations are a real thing, although they're usually not multimodal, which means that where you have both a visual and an auditory hallucination or a grief hallucination. Usually it's just one of those things. There are cases where they are multimodal and someone can see and talk to and hear from someone and all that. But that happens most of the time with senior adults. And these earliest disciples, at least the 12, were not senior adults. So I actually responded to a YouTuber who made a video about this and used grief hallucinations. And this particular YouTuber is an artist. So he drew illustrations for each of these things. And when he drew Peter, let's say, Peter was an old man with gray hair and all of those things. And then I don't think he meant to do this, but then he's throwing out the grief hallucination literature. And it's just not so likely when we're talking about people that are not in that category, senior adults. So that takes care of grief hallucinations, I think. Plus, you're going to have to deal with a lot of grief hallucinations happening to different people, Then secondly, false memories do happen. That's definitely true. But let's think about what happened with the earliest Christians. Number one, they heard the message of Jesus and they went about copying it, sharing it, telling other people the same thing over and over and over again from day one. Now, my wife traveled with me for many years and she can take some of my speeches and things like that and she could give them back to you because she sat there over and over and over while I gave those speeches. And that's what the earliest Christians were doing so that they could spread the message. So while it's true that you can have false memories, that strongly mitigates against that. And then, of course, you have a community that's all trying to guarantee that message. As for mass hallucinations, this just doesn't seem to be a thing. Mike Licona reached out.
You sure sounded confident.
Yeah, well, it's because Mike Licona, who's one of our top 3 resurrection scholars, mentioned his book a while ago. He reached out to someone in the community doing work on this to find out whether, what the state of affairs is here. And if it does happen, these multimodal mass hallucinations, that would be extremely rare. And the reasons we might have to think of something like that is someone might say, well, I went to a religious church service and somebody was supposed to get healed and everybody thought they saw it all at once together. Well, number one, there could have been some trickery involved there. But number two, maybe the guy got healed. What are you talking about?
Okay. Yeah.
So when we come to mass hallucination is not, I don't think, taken seriously by the top minds on this. And, it's interesting that this is what he raises at this moment. And that's because he just referenced the 500, the appearance of Jesus to the 500. That comes in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 7. And in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7, what's going on is an early creed. This is universally accepted by scholars in and out of the faith, that this is an early creed that goes back to very early after the events of the resurrection. And it was like a formulation, like we might teach kids in church to sing a song to remember their faith. This was like that. It was a creed of the early church that people could use to remember their faith. So the very evidence he's raising to talk about this actually turns back on poor Joe, because what it shows is that they made efforts very early on to make sure that didn't happen.
Poor Joe.
Yeah.
Poor Joe. Okay.
Oh, Joe.
Back to- Joe's great.
Where do they put it?
Well, you could put it anywhere. Like, no one knows where Genghis Khan is buried.
No.
Genghis Khan, they did the wildest thing with him. They sent a pack of people to bury Genghis Khan. Then they sent another pack of people to kill the people everybody that went to Genghis Khan's funeral was murdered. They all got murdered by another group of people, and then those group of people got murdered by a separate group to make sure that no one had any understanding at all about where Genghis Khan was buried.
Oh my
I
God.
didn't know
To this day, no one knows where he was.
And then
I think thousands of people died to hide his burial.
But it's got to be somewhere in Mongolia. Right?
Somewhere, yeah.
Yeah.
No one knows.
Yeah. I
Maybe
don't.
they could do LiDAR over the entire country and figure it out. But
Well, there'll be somebody will proclaim that they found it at some point.
maybe.
You know.
They have no idea.
Well, I hadn't heard of the Genghis Khan story for one thing.
either.
That's pretty wild. So good connection.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. He does raise this issue. In the early moments after the events of the resurrection, as I keep saying, the claim was not we don't know that where the body is. We don't know where he was buried. No, we knew. The claim is somebody stole it.
Right.
And so I think, again, that these early things kind of point not to some sort of idea that, well, we just don't have any idea what happened to the body of Jesus. Well, we know what happened to the body of Jesus. We know that he was laid in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea and all that kind of thing. But the fact is, we believe that we have an explanation of why the tomb was actually found empty. And I think it's interesting because even what I would consider to be kind of liberal scholarship, people that aren't nearly as conservative as I am, but do claim to be Christians. There's one guy, Dale Allison. He's a very respected scholar that deals with the resurrection. And he believes that Jesus was transformed into some kind of very physical, very real physical, but otherworldly kind of energy. And so that there wasn't actually a physical body. Now, I think that is outside the bonds of Christianity. I think that the Bible teaches very plainly a bodily resurrection. But even he says if you went to the tomb, you would find it empty. I remember just recently Jordan Peterson, who's not an expert in this regard, but he even said to well-known atheist YouTuber, cosmic skeptic Alex O'Connor, that Alex asked him, if you had a camera and you were pointing a Panasonic camera at the tomb, and on the little LCD screen, do you think you'd see someone come out of that tomb, see the risen Jesus? And he said, yeah, I'm inclined to think so. So I don't think the question is whether or not, or where, we don't have any idea where Jesus was buried. Really, the question is more of what happened to the body. And I just think we have a better case for what happened to the body.
Yeah, point well taken. And by the way, we do have a piece on that Alex O'Connor interview with Jordan Peterson where he dealt with these things. By the way, this is a very good friend of mine, Dr. Braxton Hunter, and we are joining together in One Life Network. We're collecting up our different ministries and YouTube channels. He is over Trinity Radio. I encourage you to go over there. And he's most famous for debating Matt Dillahunty, and most think that he won that debate, including me. And so check that out. Hope that helps. See you next time.